Welcome to the first episode of the new Reappropriate podcast. My name is Jen, and I am the writer and blogger of Reappropriate, which you can find at reappropriate.co, and I'm also on Twitter at Reappropriate. Tonight I'm having my first episode of a new podcast that I'm hoping to launch, which will tackle issues that I think are better tackled in a more conversational style. And to join me on my inaugural episode is James Lamb, who is a writer at snoopyjenkins.wordpress.com, and also he tweets at snoopyjenkins. James, do you want to say hello and add any information?
Hello, thank you for having me, Jen, and I hope this is going to be a fun discussion on the topic of the day. So let's get started.
Right. So the topic today that I wanted to tackle was affirmative action. It's a topic that I've dealt with on my blog for a number of months, and I was hoping that James and I could talk about it in more detail and address some of the questions that have been coming up over the last couple of months. So just to start off with, I'd like to provide a quick definition of what affirmative action is, particularly for users who may be coming in to the issue with some misinformation or maybe just a general lack of knowledge about what the topic's really about. Affirmative action is basically political or public policies associated with education or with employment that involve the use of background information such as race, gender, class, etc., and have those information play into or inform decisions when it comes to admissions or hiring, but are not predetermined or are not determinative of those decisions. I think that there's a lot of oversimplification of affirmative action, thinking that basically it's the kind of policy where who you are or your background basically gets people in who are unqualified for a particular position, but that isn't really how the issue is, and it's a little bit more complicated than that. James, I thought maybe you might want to weigh in on your ideas of how affirmative action is practiced in America and how you might present a more nuanced definition of it.
Certainly. The first thing we should add is that quotas do not exist. There are no quotas. They're illegal. They're just not happening. One of the biggest myths about affirmative action today is that somehow bureaucrats sit in offices thinking, well, we have to let in this new group of incoming freshmen. A certain percentage of them have to be African American, or a certain percentage of them have to be Mexican American, or a certain percentage have to be like queer Laotians from Reykjavik. It's just not happening. There are no quotas.
Well, so maybe we should clarify on why we say that, because I think, we're looking at affirmative action coming up time and time again as a political issue, and one thing I see all the time is that it's defined as, or the way that it's characterized by its opposition is in a quota system. But if we look at the history of affirmative action and how it came about, maybe, James, you could tell us about how affirmative action first came to be as an idea for a public policy, what its goals are.
Okay, so I won't be the perfect person in the history of this, but there are some great books to go to. One of the ones that's helped me in my understanding of affirmative action is Stephen L. Carter's Reflection of an Affirmative Action Baby. You can find that through Amazon or wherever books are sold. At any rate, the best way to talk about affirmative action should be to remember that during the Civil Rights Movement, there were plenty commentators who felt that the best way to deal with the real inequities in our society was to start getting at the economics of the thing. A great way of talking about this would be to remember that in the last year of his life, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Engaged the Poor People's Campaign, which was a method of public action, public activism really, to start dealing with the kind of poverty issues that so many African Americans and other poor groups face. One of the ways we can think about affirmative action is that thinking about in the late 60s and early 70s the idea that perhaps the better way of going about getting at some of these persistent systemic inequities would be to allow more people of color, more underprivileged minorities into the nation's universities and centers of higher learning. The Nixon administration popularized and promoted the idea of affirmative action, i.e., let's go find underprivileged minorities and include them into our systems, the establishment, as it were. in order to not only benefit their education in their communities, but to then give them the kind of opportunities towards upward mobility that were denied them previously, given the Jim Crow reality that was America before the Civil Rights Movement. So you have, in essence, an idea that if we just bring people from the ghettos, the rural Black America, etc., and put them into the nation's top universities, that they'll be able to work just like every other hardworking student and succeed and be totally fine. There's all manner of controversy around this then and now. There are plenty of ways where America's universities try to directly meet this new challenge. One of the noted ones would be, in my alma mater, Cornell University. The COSEP program, the Committee for Special Education Projects. Okay, I wasn't a COSEP student myself, so I may have gotten that acronym a little bit wrong. At any rate, the COSEP program was designed to do very much this thing. It was an affirmative action program to bring students who weren't hearing about or applying to Cornell because they were going to inner city schools or rural Black American schools, and said, hey, we want to recruit to you now. Why don't you bring your talents to Cornell and see what you could do? I'm sorry.
Well, so I think that you're picking up on a really important point, which is that affirmative action started out, first of all, in the Nixon administration, which I think goes against the perspective of affirmative action being this major far-left political ideology. And also, I think it speaks to the goal of affirmative action being an opening up of opportunities for people who have been historically disenfranchised and excluded from these institutions of higher learning. So it was this idea of saying, you know, if we bring you to the place where you can prove yourself, then you have the opportunity to prove yourself, correct? Sorry, James, you've muted yourself.
There we go. That's pretty much correct. One of the important points here, though, is that there was a sense of redistributive justice associated with affirmative action. We don't like to think about that today. Today, we like to pretend that we're all equal and we all have a sort of an equal shot at opportunity. And on some level, that's always been true, and on some level, that's always been false. What's interesting about the affirmative action idea was it was a way to sort of take the best and brightest from Black America, from Brown America, from elements of Asian America as well, and include them into a system that had beforehand shut them out completely, or as close to completely as it matters. Case in point, if you were an African American student of some renown and note in the 50s and 60s and 70s, there were universities for you to go to. Howard, Hampton University, Norfolk State University, which was my parents' alma mater in Virginia. But these were, generally speaking, historically Black colleges and universities. They oftentimes got a small amount of state money with which to function, and they were a way for African Americans to achieve higher learning to some degree by virtue of staying essentially within the community while doing so. And some of these are just absolutely amazing schools. Ta-Nehisi Coates, for example, right in the Atlantic, Howard University alumni, brilliant guy. And you have all manner of like scientists and lawyers and doctors who have come from these schools and did very well. What affirmative action essentially did was say, you have another option, smart Black student. You can now go to try your talents against the global marketplace before it's a professional capacity. So now you have an opportunity to learn alongside the Palestinian students and the British students and the Chinese students who've already been going to America's top universities. You get to basically try yourself where things are happening in white America too. Mm-hmm. And it was a sense, in a sense, it allowed us to get into places where we were, again, denied before, but also it brings us in such a way that it causes a lot of consternation from the right and from various other populations who watched their own kids struggle to get into school and didn't have the federal government suggesting to higher education centers, now you must include these kids too.
Right. I mean, what you're talking about is a history of the academy being institutionally exclusive of women, of people of color, of all colors, not just Black and Latino, but Asian Americans as well. And having affirmative action be a policy that seeks to, in essence, integrate those spaces and give everybody opportunities to prove themselves. And just to draw ourselves back to where we started in this conversation, I think that the challenge in the 1980s was to institute these policies of affirmative action, to find ways to integrate these spaces of higher learning with the goal of creating opportunity for people of color and women and other minorities who have been marginalized from these spaces, but not really a prescription about how to do it. And I think that one of the challenges that supporters of affirmative action have to deal with is that there are so many different ways we've seen affirmative action practiced. And there was recently an Intelligence Square debate where one of the pro-affirmative action argumenters, one of the nice things he said was, I support affirmative action, I don't support stupid affirmative action. And I think the problem is that early in the life of affirmative action as a public policy, we saw it implemented in ways that were indeed quotas, where institutions of higher learning like colleges would set a quota for Black students and Asian students and white students, and basically pick from their applicant pool to create a class that reflected their pre-established quotas. Now, for the reason why we say that racial quotas are not how affirmative action is practiced today is because in the 90s and reaffirmed later in Fisher, the Supreme Court has ruled that affirmative action as practiced through the use of racial quotas is patently unconstitutional. So when supporters of affirmative action argue in support of this policy, we don't argue in support of affirmative action as it's always been practiced. I think we support a legal practice of affirmative action, which doesn't include racial quotas. And I think one of the things that I'd love to talk with you about, James, is how do supporters of affirmative action walk that balance of supporting affirmative action while having to make this very nuanced and complex argument?
Well, two things. One, I don't think it's that nuanced an argument. I think that the best way to talk about affirmative action as practiced today, as supported today by people, by its own opponents, is to talk about public investment. In essence, in the world without affirmative action, we have seen in our world today, in America, an America that simply did not want talent from African American community. Period. It didn't matter if you were a C student or a failing student, or the top of your class, valedictorian, brightest students that entered the hallways of your high school in the last 10 years. If you were Black, without affirmative action, many colleges and universities simply didn't notice you, didn't want you, didn't care about you. That was the world before affirmative action. Today, now these institutions, the Stanfords and the Harvards and the University of Virginias of the world, have to actually recruit to African American, Latin American, Asian American students as well. And that makes for a more contentious applicant pool, more talented kids vying for fewer and fewer slots. All happening in a market where most families are finding themselves increasingly priced out of college educations for their children. An absolutely important point there. Sure, many schools, including our alma mater, Jen, Cornell, have offered public funding to students in the form of scholarships and grants and obviously some loans to help the talented students that they want to see walk their halls enter into school. A lot of students are able to go to school because of stuff like that, but there are plenty of other schools where if you simply don't have the money, once they accept you, you just aren't going. Now, the reason I bring all that up is we have a conversation about affirmative action that often does not talk about the realities that all families are facing today with rising tuition costs. And I think that's a mistake. I don't think it's all that nuanced. Our public education system, our private and public universities are designed to train citizens and non-citizens to operate the machinery of our society, generally speaking, in the future. You want to invest in the public. It's all public investment. And if we're not willing to invest in members of the public from Compton or from Atlanta or from Portsmouth, Virginia, where I'm from, but we're only interested in the kids coming from, say, I don't know, upstate New York or the Upper East Side or Crestwood or wherever else, rich white America, then that makes a statement about who we prize as a society. If we talk about affirmative action as yet another method in a long list of tools to invest in students coming from every background, I think we're okay, and I don't think that any of us have a problem with that in theory.
Right. So I think in theory, I think the issue that I'm trying to raise is that the question of affirmative action or the topic of affirmative action becomes extremely divisive. And so to bring it to the more tangible topic of the podcast, I think that the reason we're talking about affirmative action this year is because we've seen this topic become sort of a hotbed of conflict between Asian American political communities and basically other minorities. So earlier this year, affirmative action became sort of a lightning rod issue in California. And for those of you who aren't aware of what was going on in California, I'm going to give you a quick primer. So back in the 1990s, California, which is where the universities are almost exclusively on a public university system, the UC system, passed a voter referendum called Proposition 209. Proposition 209 prohibited the use of race and other background information in any sort of public institutions, hiring practices, or college admissions process, which in essence banned affirmative action in California. The consequences of Proposition 209, before I go on, I should note that Proposition 209 was supported by California's voters, but if you looked at its voters of color, Black, Latino, and Asian Americans, all of us, voted against Proposition 209, so in favor of race-conscious affirmative action by a factor of 2 to 1. Now, fast forward, we're now 15 years from the passage of Proposition 209, and Prop 209 has, in essence, been upheld in the Supreme Court, and the power of the California system to maintain this ban by voter referendum. And that's been upheld this year, actually, in the Grutter v. Bollinger Supreme Court decision, the right of states to pass these kinds of bans by a voter referendum. And over the course of the last 5 years or so, the state Senate has been trying to pass reversals or exemptions of Proposition 209 that would re-allow the universities to consider race in a narrow fashion in its college admissions process. And the reason why is actually very interesting. 1996 is the year when we saw Proposition 209 actually take effect in the demographics for the UC system. And what we saw was a dramatic, breathtaking, nearly 30% or more decrease in the representation of underrepresented minority students receiving admissions decisions or accepting and enrolling into the UC system. So where before you might have, I can't remember the numbers off the top of my head, but where you might have had 20% or 10% African American, you were down to 5% or something like that. And I have the exact numbers on my blog, and I will link them when this post goes out. But in essence, what you saw is that Proposition 209 dramatically reduced and depressed minority enrollment in the UC system, and it continued to do so for about a decade. And you did see those numbers start to creep up, and the reason is because in response to the passage of Proposition 209, the UC system acknowledged that they were having it was having a devastating impact on the ability for the schools to recruit minority students, and they found ways to try and get at the background question in other ways. So they would try to read essays in a way that might tell us a little bit more about family background, income level, etc. But that's still beating around the bush, and even if you look today, you still see an overrepresentation or a high representation of Asian American and white students in California and an underrepresentation of Black and Latino students. And I say that as over and underrepresentation relative to their statewide distribution and demographics, and that being sort of a marker of what you would expect the distribution to be, were it to be just a completely equal meritocracy. You would expect that your student body should reflect your demographics or your applicant pool in terms of race, if race didn't matter. Now, clearly, because you don't have that sort of equal reflection, race does matter. Something has happened to make it so that minority students who are Black or Latino or Native American are having a hard time getting into the UC system. So what we saw was a hope to reverse the Proposition 209 voter referendum. And this year, Senator Ed Hernandez advanced Senate Constitution Amendment 5, which was going to be a constitutional amendment providing an exemption for the UC schools. And several of the Democratic senators in the state Senate voted for it, and then there was backlash from the Chinese American community, specifically Chinese Americans. I want to say in Southern California, or I don't really remember, but there was a very vocal backlash on ethnic media outlets, on Chinese language forum boards like Weibo, and in response to that, several Asian American state senators pulled their support of SCA 5, and this created a political backlash sufficient to ultimately table SCA 5, and now it's believed that SCA 5, if it reappears, it will reappear sometime next year after a series of town halls. And during that time, when there was this big political fight between Asian Americans and basically everyone else, Asian Americans were being cast as sort of monolithically against affirmative action. And the reasons we were supposedly monolithically against affirmative action were based on arguments that could be characterized as affirmative action being anti-Asian or discriminatory against Asian Americans. So I think that this example is particularly notable because I think it points to how the affirmative action argument can be oversimplified by those who are participating in the debate, and where you can see misinformation, like ethnic media outlets characterizing SCA 5 as the next Chinese Exclusion Act, or that it violates the 14th Amendment. Things like that, which I don't think really add to the debate, and which I think really try to make it a binary sort of discussion that ignores the fact that I think is a much more complex and nuanced argument. And certainly it doesn't deal with what you brought up, James, this idea of education being a public investment that should be open to all students. So what are your thoughts on why SCA 5 became such a divisive issue and why we found so many Chinese Americans who were vocally against SCA 5?
Okay, well, again, thank you for running down the history of the SCA 5 debate. Certainly there's a lot to unpack there, so I'm going to try to do this as quickly as possible. We'll see how far I get. First off, I think to answer your direct question, the reason the SCA 5 debate turned into a vocal minority of Chinese Americans against essentially everyone else, Black people, is because usually when these conversations come up, it's, are we going to support the idea of Black kids getting to go to school or not? That's how a lot of people, sort of the layman's interpretation of the affirmative action debate. Do I care if Jamal goes to school or goes to McDonald's or gets shot and killed or whatever? And I think that entire framing is flawed, just flat out unequivocally flawed, because we are always willing and able in these affirmative action debates to run back to this idea that if Jamal's not already going to school, something's wrong with Jamal intellectually. And we end up with a lot of perceptions of and myths about Black intellectual inferiority. We go back to Charles Murray and the bell curve. We go back to pro-slavery arguments. We go back to all these ideas that are basically about code word framing for Black people are not as intelligent as the rest of us and therefore don't deserve the same rights and privileges as the rest of us. And that entire framing is completely flawed, bigoted, and unnecessary.
Well, I think that the opponents to SCA 5 would point to survey data and as well as scientific data that show disparities in SAT scores and GPA for African American students and Native American students, Southeast Asian students, relative to other Asian American students and white American students, and use that as a rationale for why white American and Asian American students deserve higher admission rates to higher education. So obviously I have opinions on that. So James, would you like to chime in?
Yeah, the people who use basic SAT scores and GRE scores and racial breakdowns of these scores in the aggregate to justify the idea that affirmative action has outlived its usefulness or should never be tried in the first place, that's about as bad as Mitt Romney taking a look at a couple statistics and then decrying over half the country as takers. It's a misuse of statistics without having to have any conversation about whether a person thinks that standardized testing in this country is culturally biased or not. And I'm not taking a position on that now. I think it is clear that it doesn't really matter if we see lower test scores from students who are generally speaking stuck with failing schools. I mean, the expectation, as usual, is that the young person who goes to school in an environment that has, say, 30% less tax revenue than the students going to school in, say, the suburban environment, like I don't know, 20 miles down the road, should be held to the exact same standards as those kids. So if your family can afford SAT prep, if your family can afford Kumon, if your family can afford all the advanced placement books to allow a student to not only take those kind of advanced placement courses but also excel in them on those tests. If your child can afford, if your family can afford like opera tickets and you go down to like the theater every weekend or what have you, you might be willing and able in that upper middle class or upper class family to develop your child's reasoning and logic skills to the point where they do better on some standardized testing than the people in the families, the children from families with fewer resources. But that's
Right.
only one dimension of many, many others. The point is, if we leave ourselves to this myth of objectivity that the scores say what the scores say, therefore some people get into school and other people can just go hang out on the corner, we're only telling the people from those poorer communities, from those minority communities, that they don't matter to this society because the society is not willing to invest in them. And that, I think, is morally reprehensible.
Right. I think that you're really picking up on that myth of meritocracy, this idea of the SAT scores being some sort of objective measure of merit for college applicants. And the myth of the meritocracy is based on this presumption that all students have equal access to the opportunities they need to demonstrate themselves on the SATs, or even if you want to say SATs and GPA, that they all have the same access to the same resources to prove themselves, so that the score reflects entirely how much hard work they put in and how much intellect they brought to the table. Well, we know just through common sense, but this is reinforced through studies, that not all families are bringing the same resources to the table. We know that the SAT scores are the best predictors, really, of the class backgrounds of the students that take them more than anything else. We know that if you are a poor student, a working class student, a student of color, you tend to do less well on the SATs, having to do less with your intellect or your merit and more to do with the social economic disadvantages that life throws at you, such that you're not adequately able to prepare for the SATs or the GPAs or grades in the same way that a student who has access to, beyond just prep courses. How about just the time it takes to study? If you are a working class student who has to take a job or who has to watch their siblings so that their parents can work in order to bring food to the table, you're going to be more distracted and less able to concentrate on school. And we don't provide the kind of social program resources for students at the K through 12 level, so that students who are disadvantaged socioeconomically have the chance to mitigate those factors and actually perform on the SATs. And then we set the SATs as sort of our single one-number barometer for whether or not students are meritorious enough to get into the colleges of their choice. And then we try to shame students of color because they don't get the same SAT scores as everyone else, and sort of, behind the hand try to imply that the reason that they're not doing as well is because of some mental deficiency rather than because of how we've basically stacked the game against them.
And I think this goes directly at the heart of the matter. If we want to have a real conversation between African Americans and Asian Americans about affirmative action, we need to recognize a few things. One of them being racial flattery is as dangerous to real people as racial condemnation. One of the worst parts about being the talented 10th black, to use W.E.B. Du Bois's term, is that people look at you as some sort of exception to a very common rule that we should all just remember. Like, if you're the black kid that makes it into college, you've done it in spite of so many challenges. It's so hard for you. Like, it's just so... your neighborhood is so infested with guns and crack and guns and chicken and crack and guns. Obviously, I'm being a little bit facetious here, but not really. The truth is that too often, all we can ever hear is, you made it because so many of the rest of people like you can never possibly make it, as if everyone you knew growing up is somehow not intelligent. But at the same time, you go to school with a whole bunch of Asian American kids who are always told that by virtue of being Asian American, they're the smartest thing they've ever seen. As if they didn't have to work for it. As if they didn't have to train really hard for it. One of the best things we can do between our communities in discussions like this is just recognize a couple of basic truths. Everyone works hard to try to get into school, and that's not enough. A lot of times it's just luck. I mean, legacy students do exist. If your parents went to a certain school, they might like to have the children of those parents. Maybe, just maybe. Or maybe sometimes your kids work really, really hard, but simply aren't able to gain the same kind of like training that you'll find in other communities. Whatever. The point is, we should be willing to admit that there are intelligent children coming from all backgrounds. And this debate, the affirmative action debates that we normally hear, the ones, especially some of the ideas promoted by the 80-20 people and a lot of other anti-affirmative action communities, simply assume, just on its face, that you don't find intelligent students from every background. And that's damaging to the entire conversation because it makes everyone defensive in a way that we don't need.
Mm-hmm. And I think that another thing that if we're going to talk about things that we need to recognize in this debate, I've had a lot of chance to interact with people who are anti-SCOFI, anti-affirmative action. And I think consistently, I think there's a myth out there that me putting myself out there as someone who supports affirmative action and who writes about this from a perspective of an Asian American is that I'm some sort of either a racial sellout or I don't understand why Asian Americans would be against it. And I just want to put that myth to rest. I actually do understand where these people are coming from. I understand that there's a lot of fear associated with affirmative action, and I understand that the myth of meritocracy is actually somewhat comforting. There's a fear that if you accept affirmative action, race-conscious affirmative action policies that would provide consideration for underrepresented minorities that do not include Asian Americans, that this would somehow create a disadvantage for Asian Americans. That if your Asian American kid is on the fence, who just hasn't performed quite as well as all the other kids, but who's performing pretty well, that kid will now be excluded from school in favor of what you would deem as a less qualified, or at least someone numerically less qualified if you were only considering SAT scores, kid from an underrepresented minority background, either by class or race or something like that, or immigration status, linguistics, whatever. And if you're the parent of that kid who's seeing a policy that might exclude your child from pursuing the college of his or her choice, that could be terrifying because you don't want your kid to face any kind of obstacle or hardship. And so you want your kid to have the easiest possible road to get to their dreams. I understand that that's the motivation for a lot of Asian Americans, but I also think that that is a very narrow interpretation or perspective on affirmative action, because as much as Asian parents are terrified of supporting policies that could disadvantage their child and make it slightly more difficult for them to get into college, which I actually don't think would be true, I would love for those Asian parents to imagine what it must be like for parents from underrepresented minority backgrounds who are facing an entire system that from the kindergarten level through to the college level says that your kid is going to be facing an uphill battle just to get into college. And we see that with discrimination within the classroom, and we see that when it comes to how often they get picked by their teachers to answer questions and support their education and support their questions in the classroom, and also finally when it comes to the admissions process. So I think that, I had a user on Twitter asking, how can we persuade Asian Americans that affirmative action is necessary in college admissions? And I think part of that just comes from, that was Eugene Hong asking me that earlier today. And I think that that's a really important, that's the essential question for this podcast, is how do we reconcile the Asian American outlook on affirmative action, which is really based on concern for Asian American children and their opportunities, with this view of affirmative action as a public investment, not in Asian American children, but in all children.
Okay, I'm going to disagree with you a little bit here. When I think of that Asian American parent who's concerned about a public policy that they perceive as disadvantaging their child, I won't say I get nauseous, but I certainly kind of take a bit of a offense there. That's racial tribalism. Can we just call it what it is, please? It's racial tribalism. It's, I want my people to succeed, and screw those folk. That's all that really is. And I'm not exactly certain why we should give, understanding and empathy towards the racial tribalists among us. Case in point, African-American parents who want to see their kids go into the best possible schools, we get it. It's so hard being black, okay. But if your children aren't performing the stuff that they could do, if you're not performing in the classroom, if your kids are spending so much, I don't want to get completely President Obama and Bill Cosby with it, but there is a sense that we usually just deride their points of view that we should just tell the black community to just work harder and smarter and better as respectability politics. There's some truth to that, and there's some truth to the derision that respectability politics has as a term in activist communities on these things. We don't want to tell people that your rights are somehow only useful when you're performing the best possible talented 10th persona in public imaginable. I'm not saying that. What I am saying is that affirmative action isn't something that exists to give every black kid, no matter what they're doing in the classroom, a shot at college. The affirmative action exists to give the people who have already shown merit, however way they could show it in the background that they're in, an opportunity to go to college. So you still have to do the work, black people. And we know you are, many of you, and we know that many of you don't. Like every community, there are some people who care about academics and some who don't care about academics. The difference here with the racial flattery and the racial tribalism is that assumptions are made about the whole that are true for the part in every community. There are some incredibly dedicated, incredibly studious Asian American students. But I want to give every Asian American parent out there looking at their beautiful sheriff with the bowl cut joke a little bit of a statement about their kid. Maybe your kid is smart. Maybe your kid isn't smart. Maybe your kid's just normal, average, standard. Maybe your kid's below average. Whatever. It's just you want the best for your kid, okay, but we can't take that desire and blow it up to a racial aggregate. Once we start doing that, every Chinese kid, every black kid, that's racial tribalism, and I don't see how there's any room in that for useful public policy.
And I also want to jump in on this idea of the Asian parent looking just at their own kid and presuming, and understandably so, that their kid is exceptional in some way and deserves the best college, deserves Harvard or Yale or wherever they want to go. Maybe UC Berkeley, I guess, if they're in California. But I think that the reason that this issue has always chafed for me is that I consider myself part of a larger community, not just part of the Chinese American community with a monolithic idea on affirmative action, which I don't even think is true, but a part of an Asian American community and a part of the larger American fabric. We're talking about public investment. Affirmative action is public investment in our youth. And I think that for Chinese American opponents to affirmative action, the reason why I would really love for you to reconsider your position is that this shouldn't be a me first a me-first motivation when it comes to affirmative action and public policy and college admissions. It should be about how do we create a system that gets all the deserving youth in a fair fashion to college, because we understand that college is just the next step, the next opportunity towards pursuing the career that they really want to better themselves, economic mobility. So Johnson Pham, who is watching this podcast right now, posted a question talking about how he also, I think, he says, I got called a race traitor by my own community as a Vietnamese American supporting SCA5. I feel the narrative of refugee Asian American communities and Pacific Islanders always get shafted in the argument of how affirmative action harms Asians. And one thing, I think that's really important, and I felt the same thing. I was called a race traitor multiple times in multiple forums where I couldn't read them because they were in Chinese. But what I really think is important to point out here is how the narrative about Asian Americans in SCA5 is actually a narrow subset of the Asian American community, with Chinese Americans asserting a monolithic viewpoint that actually excludes the rest of the Asian American community. Southeast Asian Americans, Pacific Islanders, these are communities that deal with a lot of socioeconomic challenges. And who have actually low enrollment rates in the California school systems, similar to other underrepresented minorities. Now, at the time in 1995 when Proposition 209 passed, the applicant admission data for Southeast Asians and Pacific Islanders wasn't really being collected and disaggregated in that fashion. And we don't really know how SCA5's passage might impact Chinese Americans versus Southeast Asians versus South Asians versus Pacific Islanders. So that's sort of an unanswered question. But the presumption is that now that we have that disaggregated data, we can see how some Asian Americans are being underrepresented in the UC system versus others, that affirmative action, when passed, would actually help these Asian Americans. And yet I think that the way that some Chinese Americans approach this question, it's so small. It doesn't think of not even all Americans. It doesn't even think of all Asian Americans and how affirmative action can benefit them. And I think that if we were to answer Eugene Hong's question of how do we persuade Asian Americans that affirmative action is important, I think it's an idea of reaching out towards this idea that we're not just here by ourselves as Chinese Americans or any other kind of Asian Americans, that we're part of a larger political landscape, a larger dream, if you will, not to get too, idealistic about this, but we aren't just here for our own families, but we're here to invest in this country and create policies and advocate for policies for our people, which isn't just Chinese Americans, it isn't just our children, but people next to us, our neighbors, Asian Americans who are being disadvantaged, who need affirmative action to try and get through and hopefully appeal to this idea of community and not clinging to this idea of me-first politics.
See, the difficulty there is that you can't sell that to the middle-aged Chinese American woman who wants to see her baby get into Stanford. Like, she does not care about anyone else's kids. Like, the first thing we should know about this woman is that she does not care about anyone else's kids. Like, for me, it's not about empathy. I don't want someone to imagine the plight of what it's like for people like me when I was 18. Because they don't care about that story. They need to imagine the world that they're going to live in where we have such income inequality and no way to bridge that gap because those on the bottom have never developed the skills necessary to take part in America's corporate information society. We can either have a society where people have a chance to approach some level of mobility, or we cannot. We can either have a society where the suburban kids who are more likely to be white and Asian go away to school and become everyone's bosses, or we can have a society where, because all kids from all communities can approach those, that sort of higher living standard through education and through what they do with their education, that we have enough that we're able to divide that intelligence throughout the society, so that you have the smart kids who went to Cornell living in the inner city as well, making those communities better. But whatever. The real truth here is that a lot of these parents aren't going to care. And the best way to explain affirmative action to them is to explain that if their kid is so smart, that kid can compete against me too. I mean, this is the best part of it for me. We're really talking about competition in the classroom, what you do when you get there. If we're telling certain groups of people that they never belong there, we're telling the rest of the kids who do belong, they're the smartest Asian and whites since all the blacks and Latinos aren't around, and that doesn't help anybody. If you're really all that intelligent, if you're the best poet that you've ever seen in your high school, if you're the best chemist to come through those halls in like 30 years, then you should be able to bring that intelligence to a place where you can compete against everyone. I mean, honestly, I would not have felt this way had I not gone to Cornell University, the most international of the Ivy Leagues, and obviously the largest population. I had to be able to defend what I thought about politics against people from backgrounds that were completely different from mine. I had to be able to talk about the Israeli and Palestinian issues with actual Israelis and actual Palestinians. For these people, it wasn't abstract. They lived that in Tel Aviv. And so I need to be able to have those discussions with them in my political classes as we're all learning together. That's how you create people ready for a global economy. If you're not interested in doing that for people from all sectors of America willing to work, then you're basically saying that the entire American dream and our belief in capitalism doesn't work. And that's the argument that I would have with the possible parent of a well-intentioned Chinese American student. If your kid is so smart, bring him into the classroom with me and let's see what he can do.
And I agree. I think that in California, I posted earlier this year several studies that have shown that this isn't just some like head in the clouds kind of liberal viewpoint here. Diversity in the classroom, on-campus diversity produces tangible benefits to student learning, to student critical thinking, questions, discussions. You want to have a student body that represents a diversity of backgrounds, not just because of some political correctness, but because it actually makes the quality of the learning environment better for all students. And so I've made the argument on my blog that the idea of supporting SCA5 is also to benefit the Asian American students who will be going to the University of California under a system of race-conscious affirmative action. Because the students that are admitted to the University of California who are Asian American will walk into a classroom where the students that they interact with, or the students that they interact with outside of the classroom, will offer opinions and perspectives and diversity of thought that will challenge them and force them to think about themselves. And the more homogenous a classroom is, the more homogenous a campus is, the less likely a student is going to be made to challenge their own thinking. And yes, I say that from also having been at Cornell, which was a very diverse campus that still was over 30% Asian American. But I've invited James to be on this podcast. James and I have interacted with each other for 15 years. We come from very different places on the political spectrum, very different backgrounds in terms of family, culture, etc. And I think that our interactions being so different is what helped me consider my own viewpoints and shape them. We're coming up on the last couple of minutes of the podcast, and I did really just want to touch on the more tangible ideas of how affirmative action is practiced and where sort of the current thought is. So now we know that we can't do racial quotas. We know that the goal is public investment and trying to bring more students and give them the opportunities to be in places of higher learning. And I really want to touch on this idea of holistic review because we've talked about how we would like to create race-conscious affirmative action, but we also understand from the Supreme Court that we can't allow race or any other background information to be the primary determinative factor for admissions decisions. So one myth I kind of just constantly want to hammer and dispel is this idea that college students or students for college are putting in their applications, and they're checking a box on race, and that box somehow determines whether or not they're going to get in or not. And many of the studies that we've seen against affirmative action, for example, the classic one is the Espenshade study, which ranks the degree to which students of different races get into school based on their SAT scores, showing that, for example, Asian Americans have, something like a 100-point disadvantage, quote unquote, to getting into an Ivy League school based on their race. suggests that somehow the race is determinative of whether or not these students are getting in. And that's not actually how affirmative action is practiced in colleges today. In reflection of the fact that racial quota systems are unconstitutional, illegal, and should not be practiced, and no one who supports affirmative action supports that kind of system, holistic review is the idea that because we understand that SAT scores don't create an objective single measure of students, basically what we want to make our admissions decisions is more information, and as much information as possible to create an admissions package that reflects the complexity of the student who's applying. So holistic review is a system that has not just the SAT score and the GPA, but also where the student came from, their parents, their income, their race, their essays, their reference letters, and creates a different a review score that's based on all of these different factors. Oyan Poon, who has served on admissions boards in various institutions of higher education, and who has also written on this topic, estimates that there's somewhere like 900 different criteria that go into holistic review. And the reason I bring that up is because the affirmative action debate is coming to a head in New York City right now, and I think is getting something of a political revival, because the public school system, now this is K through 12, in New York City, includes some very competitive private high schools, one of which is Stuyvesant. And the problem is that although public school students all have the ability to go to Stuyvesant, they have to compete to get in based on a single admissions exam. And it turns out that this past year, Stuyvesant admitted just 7 black students in a public school environment that is, I think, about 15% or more African American, and they admitted just 21 Latino students, 21 to 24 Latino students in a district that is something like 30 to 40% Latino. By contrast, at Stuyvesant, the student body is 72.5% Asian American, even though the city is itself 13.5%. And so that's created a political conversation over whether or not the school districts are now going to switch from a single entrance exam towards holistic review. And they have not said that the holistic review is going to include race, but they are introducing this idea specifically to address what seems to be a completely one-sided racial balance in the New York City public school district. So, James, I wanted to get your idea on maybe what this says about the holistic review process itself, like whether or not this is just code for people to get onto the case of affirmative action, even though no one is talking about affirmative action here.
I think it's going to be used as code for people who don't want to see any change in the status quo. And I think our earlier discussion about the proverbial Chinese American mother is very much useful here. If you believe there's something positive about the current state of affairs where a single test is used, students take the test, and we end up with 72.5% Asian American enrollment in schools like Stuyvesant, Bronx Side, etc., you think there's nothing wrong with that and that's the way it's supposed to be, then any change to this is going to be met with hostility from that kind of person. I look at those numbers and think this is difficult. But I don't want to see anything done in a new review of students that would alter the standards necessary to get into these schools in any way, in the sense that it should still be as rigorous as it was before, if not more so. And I think holistic review done properly and done the way they're planning on doing in New York City will give you a more rigorous evaluation of students, not a less rigorous one. And I think that's the important key here. If you're African American or Latino, the only thing you should ever argue for in an affirmative action debate is more rigorous testing of students. Period. You want to see your kids, and all kids really, tested to find out just exactly what they can do, so that you know that once the few students who do get in after an affirmative action regime is instituted, you'll know those kids have a chance at succeeding on the higher level to which they will now be tested. That's the kind of thing you want. More testing. The whole idea that parents from African American and Latino communities would be upset with a single test and then say the test is too hard. Any parent saying something like that, and I'm not saying that many parents do, you have isolated incidents of this, which is why I'm addressing it. those kinds of statements aren't helpful for anyone. What we should want as people of color generally, and underrepresented minorities in particular, is the most rigorous testing of students possible, so that when our students do succeed, there's no doubt that they are as intelligent as we say they are.
See,
Which is
I
a very
actually
important thing, because so much of this conversation from the proverbial Chinese mother and a whole lot of other conservative thinkers besides, many, many conservative thinkers, is this assumption, again, of African American, Latino inferiority. That's not what we want to suggest at all.
I actually completely disagree with you, James. I'm a little annoyed with you that you brought up something controversial in the last 2 minutes of this podcast. I completely disagree with you because I think that the body of literature that we have shows that the standardized testing, the rigorous testing environment that we have in public education, in college admissions, is not reflecting the quality of our students. I don't think that getting a 1500 or a 1600, well, wait, sorry, we're now on the 2100 system, 2400 system, whatever. If you get a perfect score on the SATs, when I was taking it, it was a 1600 score. If you get a 1600, then my computer just crashed. Okay, sorry. If you get a 1600 on the SATs, that doesn't necessarily mean that you are more qualified for college than if you got a 1500 or a 1400 or a 1200. It only means that you can take standardized tests. And I don't think that we should move towards an environment of more testing. I think we need to move towards the holistic review system, which acknowledges, and many scientists have shown this, that standardized test scores are just one of several different pieces of data that an admissions officer can use to judge merit, and that other things like participation in extracurricular activities or the quality of the essay that's written, that these will give you different pieces of information, different indicators of student merit. And holistic review provides a sort of a nuanced, multifaceted idea of this student and whether or not they should get in. So that if you got a 1300 on an SAT score, you could still be more qualified for college and succeed better than someone who got a 1500. And when we recognize that people are not just one number, but multifaceted, and that they may not perform as well on these tests, I think that's the kind of system we should really want.
I don't disagree with much of that. My concern is that there's a political reality to all of this. And the political reality is, I can't, as an African American man, convince the proverbial Chinese mother that kids like me are as deserving or more deserving than their children to go to college. Trust me, I've had those conversations, okay? Those never work out well. You can't convince them. You're not supposed to convince them because, frankly, those people and those families don't give up about me. They just don't. The political reality is that if you're the young black guy going off to Cornell, every day you're there, someone needs proof that you are intelligent enough to be in that space. And they're never gonna start asking for that proof. And there are plenty of people today, millennials, who just call these microaggressions. Ignorant term. Flat out silly. It's not microaggressions, it's just the facts. People don't think you belong there because they themselves have bigoted notions about your intelligence. You're still going to have to work in the same environment as them. They still are voting members of your society, your country. You've still got to be able to talk to them about political issues. You've still got to convince them of some things. And there's no way to do that unless people have the belief that the holistic review system is as rigorous or more so as the current standardized testing system. I am not suggesting, for example, the kind of testing regimes you'll find in some well-meaning charter schools, like the Achievement First system that's popular not only in New Haven, Connecticut, where we are, but also in New York City, where they're basically testing every few weeks, and there's always a test happening to get all these metrics about kids. That's just pressure that no child needs, that no one needs, frankly. What I'm suggesting is, when we're talking about using the SAT score as a way to get into college, or that this placement test to get into Stuyvesant or Bronx Science, here's this one metric. Holistic review says we need more than one metric, but we're thinking about holistic review in a political environment where 72% of Asian American kids who are taking this test or not taking the test, but 72% of the enrollees at Bronx Science or a Stuyvesant are Asian American, and 7 are black kids get into 7. You can count them on 2 hands. 7 black kids get in these kind of schools. We can't pretend that those kind of numbers are okay with us. Institute a holistic review, and then look at the holistic review numbers, which will more than likely increase the number of blacks and Latinos getting into these schools, and say, that's fine, we don't owe anyone any political explanation for any of this. No, the explanation should be and has to continue to be something that reassures all Americans involved that rigorous testing of students, however we're talking about it, with essays. Essays can be tests too. Trust me, that's all I had at Cornell. The rigorous essays that they write and the standardized testing and a whole lot of other conversations and other metrics besides can be used effectively to evaluate student performance. I don't want to stress out kids, but I do want to suggest that there's nothing wrong with suggesting to the public that the kids who are going to get into higher level schools as a result of holistic review are just as qualified as the students who were getting in before that regime was instituted.
Yes, and I think that's a perfect place for me to add my final word, and we can cut it. So in California, after SCA 5 was tabled, Senator Hernandez basically said that he was going to have a bunch of town halls, and I think this is actually the perfect place we need to leave this debate. I think that there's a lot of lack of information, maybe misinformation, maybe just a little bit of questions and ignorance about how holistic review works, how it is a rigorous process, how people who get through holistic review are qualified, even if their SAT scores are not the same as someone who didn't get through, that it is a process. But the problem is that colleges have historically been very reluctant to pull the veil back and tell us what the admissions process is, understandably. And I think we need to find some sort of middle ground where we can inform the voting public, Asian Americans and everybody else, about how college admissions works, and we can continue to have this debate, but have this debate in a more educated, more rational, and more reasoned fashion where we're really looking at the facts and we're looking at the science and we're really talking about this issue. Because as I hope this hour comes to a close, we've all sort of come to, affirmative action is actually a very complex debate. And even those of us who support it, there's a lot of diversity within that opinion. And it's not just a cut and dry black or white issue. And it's one that I was trying to get at earlier on the podcast is actually requires a very complex and nuanced idea of where you stand on it. So James, I want to thank you for joining me on this first podcast. There might actually be enough room for us to have a second conversation on this topic, maybe, maybe not. And mostly I just want to thank you for joining me and getting me off my butt and making a podcast, because I think it's been long overdue. We've actually been talking about doing this for several months. So thank you, James.
Thank you for having me.
And also I want to thank those of you who are listening to this podcast right now or maybe watching it on YouTube. I want to thank the viewer who watched this live for sticking around and watching with us. As you know, this podcast is going to be a regular podcast. We're going to settle on regular broadcast time and try to do it in a way where we encourage real-time interactions with the audience so that we can try to answer questions as they appear. We're also trying to deal with formatting issues. I also don't have a name for this podcast, and I'm encouraging people to submit name suggestions, because right now it's just called the Reappropriate podcast. So I welcome any feedback that you might have on this podcast, and I look forward to recording the next one. Thanks everyone for joining us.